Hey, what's up? Welcome back to Farm Clubs, where we grow things with podcasts. Today, we're growing an app with Daniel J. Lewis from Podgagement.
And I built this engine to start tracking the podcast charts inside of Apple and Spotify. And I thought, I want to do something with this someday. But it wasn't then until a few years later that I started to learn a lot more and started building what's now called Podgagement. And it was rebuilding that software product from scratch. But I loved it because now I can build what I want. And I don't have to wait for some team somewhere else to get the work done for me. It depends on me, which is a bit stressful. But it also means that I don't have to worry about communicating it as well to them. And that's where I really struggled. How do I communicate? How can I just get you to tap into my brain to know exactly what I want built here? And I couldn't communicate that very well, but now that I'm the one who built this completely myself, wrote every line of code that's in this app, I can make it do what I want it to do. And it is that direct tap into my own brain.
That's amazing. And let's get to what you wanted to do and what the basis of that was and how it formed, because that's really how I tracked you down, because I was fiddling, just pondering and poking around in charts from the different database backends and things like that for Spotify, for Apple. And then I started doing research and going down Reddit rabbit holes and things. And I just started to realize, I'm like, why are all these shows of people I know, we're all like at the top and we don't even, where are we on Apple? Where are we on Spotify? So the whole thing became a maddening kind of a goose chase, right? So it turned out that you simply can't find that. I know the data exists, but I'm like, where is that? Why can't I just go and see out of Apple says we have 3 million podcasts. I'm like, okay, well, I can find mine by name when I look it up. So why isn't there a little field next to it that simply says which number of those 3 million that I am? Super simple for them to apply. But I'm like, why don't they do that? Why are they hiding this? Are they doing it like to keep it foggy so that creators keep creating in the dark and they can just milk us for content? I'm like, that's puzzling. So when I saw your app, while I'm not sure it answers that question, it became super fascinating. So how did you start? Like, what was the first idea when you were gathering data from the charts back in the day from like Apple and Spotify? You said you didn't really know what you'd do with it, but clearly, like I would think too, it's like, well, this is definitely useful. It's interesting to look at, right? What did you really want to pull out of there as a new podcaster that you thought might be useful in the beginning?
Yeah, Podgagement's first version, called something else, used to track only ratings and reviews. And I wanted to start tracking the rankings inside of these charts too. And so that's why I started building the new version and started tracking those charts years ago before I even knew how to do anything with them. I just thought, I better start tracking these now. I'll get to building this feature at some point. But along the way, that's when I also discovered other data from Apple Podcasts. And so I've been tracking on a separate website, podcastindustryinsights.com. I've been tracking how many podcasts are in Apple Podcast and how many episodes are available and how long have these podcasts been active and how long ago did they last publish an episode. Like all of this other data came from building this charts and tracking feature. And going back though to that feature, podcasters like to know how they're doing. Sometimes we just don't really get that impression when we look at our download stats. We might see, all right, the latest episode got 100 downloads. That's nice. And I do recommend to people, imagine however big that number is or however small it may be, imagine that many people coming into a room to hear you speak every week or however frequently it is that you publish your episodes.
Yeah, that's realistic.
Puts then, a visual on how your reach is. Imagine that many people coming back week after week or day after day of your daily. But then there are other metrics too that we wonder, like, okay, great. There are this many people downloading or probably listening. How much do they like the show? And is my show growing compared to other shows? And so that's why I wanted to start tracking some of the engagement metrics for podcasters, not just tracking how are things downloaded and how are people listening. That's for the podcast hosting providers and the platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. They track some of that and report it to you. But I wanted the stuff that was really the human factor of this, the feedback that you get from your audience. In Podgagement, we allow people to send you written or even voicemail feedback to your podcast. So you can literally hear from them and use their voices in your podcast, tracking the ratings and reviews so people can see how their podcast is being loved or maybe hated across the world. Like when a podcast goes into Apple Podcast, it goes into up to 175 other countries, each with their own ratings, reviews, and rankings for a podcast. So for a podcaster to check that all themselves would take 1,400 mouse clicks just to check the ratings and reviews for what we do for them with Podgagement every day. But then there are the charts too. You want to know, all right, this other podcast that seems to be pretty popular, there is no way to actually know how many downloads a different podcast has. But if you're both in the chart, you can start to see, okay, are they climbing in the chart? Do they jump up and then back down? Are you climbing in relation to them? Or even just look only at your own podcast and look at it as something you can celebrate. It is a sign of success to climb the charts. Your success does not depend on your position in the charts, but there is also a little bit of some growth potential with that because yes, as you show up in more charts and higher in the rankings, that does mean you get in front of more audiences. But it all comes back to you have to have a great podcast that engages the audience that you have, however big that is. So Podgagement, short for podcast engagement, is providing tools to help you build that engagement and then track those results.
I think, is there still hidden information though? I mean, obviously like part of the engagement stuff you just mentioned, the each individual show's downloads, like you just have to ask them. And I think do they sell access to that?
No, Apple Podcast does not sell that. Spotify either. There are certain other sites out there like Listen Notes and Podchaser and some different places that guess what it is. And
right.
I've seen those guesses be way off sometimes. And I've seen them be pretty close sometimes, but you just can't really know.
No. So if you can go in and see where others are on the charts, okay, that's, I think, where the framing where I get lost, because the charts don't include all of the podcasts, do they?
Right. There are nearly 3 million podcasts in Apple Podcasts, and it would be unreasonable to make a chart with 3 million listings on it. So the way Apple does it is, again, remember that there are 175 different countries with their own charts.
Yeah.
So just within a single country, then there is the all podcast chart. That's where you typically see Joe Rogan as number one or near number one in that chart. That is of all podcasts, of all genres. But then each individual genre has its own chart as well. So that would be, if you're in the technology category, you might not rank in the all podcast chart, but you might rank in the technology chart, depending on how many more recent subscribers or followers that you get for your episodes compared to everyone else that's in that chart. So it is really showing just that view of just that genre. And it is limited right now. It's limited to 250 podcasts in each chart, or up to 250. But still, that is a pretty good number, especially when you consider that although, yes, there are 3 million podcasts out there, if you look over at the stats on podcastindustryinsights.com, you can see how many podcasts there are in each genre, as well as what about how many podcasts in each genre have even published an episode in the last 90 days. That number is much smaller than 3 million. So never think that you are competing against 3 million podcasts. You might be competing against only a few thousand other podcasts, especially if you were to narrow it down to how many people have published an episode within the last week. That's a big way that you can stand out, is by publishing content consistently and frequently.
So cadence is important for sure.
Then when you get in that chart of 250 or so, it is a thing worth celebrating because you've made it into that top 250 of your genre.
Well, yeah, you're out of the fog.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing. I'm trying to like sort through the fog for the people that aren't the top 250 podcasts of Apple or Spotify. And that seems impossible. And like I said, like we self-select our podcast categories, for example, business or leisure or news and information, whatever. And they, as far as I can recall, there's only 3 choices there on our dashboards on the podcast platforms. So my thought is, why don't like a Spotify or Apple just simply show us that position on the 3 charts? Like here's John's show. It's on these 3 categories. It ranks number 50,000 million on this one, and so on and so forth. Because I know they have the data. And so it just seems cynical to me that they would keep that, not just from us, but from you also. You can't get it, we can't get it. So you, and I don't want to devalue or denigrate anything you were working on at all. I don't hope it doesn't sound that way, because what you're doing is like good pods on steroids. And I've had several episodes on this show about the value or not of good pods, and I don't like to give them a hard time, but it's all so relative. However, it is how the podcasters I know, we've met each other, and how we've climbed up and bettered our own shows. We've got on top of those charts, and it's fun to see when you get yourself above Joe Rogan or NPR or something like that. Right. But that's where it started blowing my mind. I'm like, well, what's the point then? If we're over here on these charts really high, we're not on Apple at all, we're not on Spotify at all. So to me, then none of the 3 even matter. In a way, of course, they matter in the way you talked about. We need some kind of measurement, or we really are operating in the dark. So yeah, that was driving me crazy. Does that bother you that you can't get access to the true data?
Well, you're saying from the consumer side or from the podcaster side?
From a podcaster that's trying to like set a strategy, and you just want to look at like, okay, out of these 3 million podcasts or 30 million or however many, where are we? Where do we rank? And if they sold the API to that and charged it, you come from the music industry, right? You're familiar with like Variety or Billboard or magazines like that. Man, people paid a lot of money for a Billboard subscription just to be able to open it up and look at the back and see how they were compared to the other artists in the industry. And we just really don't have that in a way that we could, because, we only had prints back then. So of course it was limited to 100 or 200, but now we have technology and AI. I'm like, why can't it just find me out of 3 million podcasts and show me where I rank?
Yeah, and that would be possible to do if they expose certain things like the subscription numbers or follower numbers, download numbers. And a lot of podcasters just don't want that information exposed, which kind of makes sense. But like you look at, the bestseller list or these top Billboard charts and things are often based on sales or plays in some way. And looking at like a sales list, bestsellers list, the currency in podcasting is really following that podcast, or some apps still call it subscribing.
Yeah.
That is how you pay, or that is how you are exchanging that value and helping to boost that podcast ranking is by following it in the podcast app. And I think even those Billboard charts and such for music don't include every single album ever there is. They're just looking at what are the top whatever level, because they have to cut it off somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's a valid point right there, because of those 3 million, how many are really active? How many should even qualify for being in a chart? Like when you have the Grammys, you don't include every album ever recorded. You include just the ones that are in this current period. And to your point, yeah, there aren't very many that are active, or what they call pod fade. Man, we could go on a whole rabbit hole about the idea of pod fading, because I think sometimes people only have 3 episodes in them. Like that's their whole story. They got a intro story, like an origin story, and a middle piece, and then a closing piece. So the pod fade thing is interesting, but it does really clutter up the charts with a bunch of shows that were only intended to be short and just aren't active, but they're evergreen,
Well, that goes to what is actually powering the charts. And SEO charts are a different matter, which Podgagement, by the way, will start to track. So I know you love
that.
SEO.
Yeah,
so
I was looking at that button, right.
But the charts as they are right now are looking at, think of it as, what are people actually still interested in right now? So what is number 1 in the charts is not necessarily the podcast that has the most downloads ever. It's what is getting, at least for Apple Podcasts, what is getting the most new followers within the last few days. So that's why Midas Touch, for example, made news as they became the number 1 podcast in all podcasts inside both Apple Podcasts and Spotify. But then they've been dropping back down in those stats because, yes, they got for a moment, for a few days, they got more new followers than Joe Rogan and Mel Robbins and some of those other top podcasts got within that same amount of time. But maybe that was just the burst of attention. And now since that burst of attention has waned, they're falling back down in the charts. So the Apple Podcast charts, and similar with the Spotify ones, they're really looking at what are people loving lately. Now, Serial, that's a podcast that is no longer active, as far as I know. Yeah, they put stuff out every now and then, just some feed drops. But we could basically say that show is retired. It's not being hosted anymore. Is it still a good podcast? Well, yeah, lots of people think so. So should a good podcast still show up in search results or even potentially show up in rankings if enough people are following it? Yes. Now, if the charts were based on just lifetime popularity, then no one could ever get into the charts unless they somehow manage to overtake. They have to focus the charts on what is recent. It's like the New York Times bestseller list is just what's best selling lately, not of all time.
Yeah, it harkens back to that old thing in Billboard #1 with the bullet, the bullet rising up. So it really is a velocity that they're measuring. It's not just momentum. It's a momentum and speed at the same time. That's interesting. Yeah, especially the Midas touch thing. I always heard that the losing party has a heyday with media. So when the left is in power, all the right-wing media takes off. I don't have to name names, but, and then when it flips, when the right wing is in power, left-wing media explodes with popularity. Like the undervoice always gets a boost. It's pretty funny. But I guess it keeps things well balanced. It's kind of annoying when you're not trying to pay attention to the chaos or the static in the public sphere. But yeah, it's fair. I guess it's fair. But it is an interesting insight into how Midas Touch became #1. I heard that on Pod News Weekly the other day. And I'm like, what? That's crazy. Because I've seen those goobers all over YouTube forever. And okay, here's another thing. Like, is theirs really a podcast? Do they have an RSS feed? And I'm not trying to get into audio versus video because, I don't know, video has always come across the radio waves, so it's not an issue. My issue with this argument is I think we're going in the wrong direction. Is that I think podcasts have to be portable. If you can't download the MP3 or MP4 file, to me, it's not a podcast. Yeah. So is Midas Touch a real podcast, or is it just a YouTube stream?
It is available as a podcast in podcast apps. So yes, it is a true podcast then.
Fair. What do you consider a podcast? I mean, you probably avoid the video audio conversation the same, but do you think a podcast should have to be downloadable?
Oh, I don't avoid the argument at all. I am not ashamed to say.
Do you consider video? I mean, where do you stand on the video to audio while we're there?
Well, podcasts have always been both video and audio.
Yeah.
So really the question is, what is a podcast? And I would define a podcast, it's really a label for a particular distribution method. It is not the style of show or anything. It's just a distribution method.
Yep.
And a podcast then is a show that is syndicated through an RSS feed and downloadable through that feed that you could get it in whatever podcast app you want to use.
Right.
So it is a show first distributed as a podcast. So like Midas Touch, for example.
Yep.
It is a show. It is the Midas Touch show, although they call it the Midas Touch podcast, but it is a show that they distribute as a podcast. They also distribute it on YouTube. So since YouTube, you cannot follow an RSS feed on YouTube, you cannot follow something that's only on YouTube inside a podcast app or download things and take them offline or take them wherever you want to.
Right.
So therefore, I say, I know this is a controversial position, but I don't care. I say everything on YouTube is not a podcast. There are no podcasts on YouTube. Yes, there are shows that people cross-publish on YouTube, and they also publish them as a podcast, and they publish them on X and on their Facebook page and on LinkedIn, and maybe they live stream it somewhere. It is a show distributed in multiple ways.
Yeah, that to me doesn't sound controversial at all, especially because my line in the sand is the downloadable file factor. If it's not an MP3 or 4, and I don't want some crazy ass proprietary file either. I mean, a regular file I could play on any computer if I even opted not to have a podcast player. And you're right, distributed through RSS, so I get a notification, or I could set it up the way I want using the multitude of RSS players and viewers. So, yeah, it's pretty straightforward to me. It's kind of one of those things where society gets pulled into this left-right divide when I really think it's bottom-top. It's the billionaires versus the rest of us. And in this case, I think the podcasters get stuck on the video-audio thing where, no, that's not it. The battle is portability or not portability.
Yes.
So I'm glad we agree there. That's awesome. So, okay, we've already talked about my complaints, not about your app. We're talking about the general complaints of lack of data transparency with podcasting behemoths. So let's talk about the cool stuff in Podgagement, because there is so much cool stuff. I was watching a lot of the videos just now on YouTube, like Dave Jackson did one. There's another gal who did one several months ago. It looked like on the mobile version. That was cool. But let's just from an audio standpoint, talk about some of your current favorite features and what's coming up that you're most excited about.
Yeah, we already mentioned the ratings and reviews. We track your rankings across a bunch of charts. Now, just let's do a little math. I know, never do math live on a podcast, but this is a pop quiz for you. So if there are 175 different countries, and each of them have their own rankings, ratings, and reviews, and their own charts for each of the 150 plus genres, how many charts in total do you think that we check for you through Podgagement? Just throw out a number.
Holy moly. 16,000.
Nearly 34,000 charts.
Holy moly.
So yeah, you could go through. There is a way that you could go through and check all of these yourself, but ain't nobody got time for that, as one philosopher once said.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
So you have to isolate the data you want to select, right? You're pulling it all. Right. But the viewer, me on my dashboard at Podgagement, can just simply select pull down a pull down menu and sort through. It looked like 3 major fields when I was looking at Dave Jackson's example.
Well, like what we do is when you look at your overview first, is you get to see here are all of the charts that you've ranked in and all of the countries where those charts have been, where you have actually ranked. So then you can click on any one of those to see the historical view of where did you position in that chart over time. So like if we're taking Joe Rogan, for example, and you look at all podcasts, you would see it's pretty much just a straight line of between 1, 2, and 3 straight for months and months. But you look at other podcasts, well, let's jump back to Midas Touch. Mm-hmm. You see an up and down, up and down, up and down, never going above number 50 or so in all podcasts until the beginning of February, and then they skyrocket to number 1. That might indicate something else could be going on. I don't know. But you can then see that historical information. And some of it you can glean insights from, especially if you know your publishing schedule, because for some of these podcasts, I can tell just looking at the chart position and their rankings when they publish their episodes, because every time they publish an episode, they jump back up in the charts, which that tells me, and should tell other podcasters, if you want to rank highly in the charts and stay there, maybe consider publishing episodes more frequently, but always focus on the value of the episode.
Yeah, no, this is really important. I hope I can visualize this to the audience appropriately. But if you're looking at a chart, a lot of times, like you said, Midas Touch, for example, will simply spike. It'll spike up and drop down, and spike up and drop down each episode, whereas a Rogan stays up, and that is the power of branding versus the power of promotion. If you promote, you simply have a spike. The promotion, the newness, the novelty fades, and it goes away until you produce another one. Well, somebody like Rogan has a big enough back catalog that even though he makes one main one, I think, and then chops them up during the week, he has a long enough tail now that keeps his lift so high because his brand is so strong. So his line stays along the top of the chart forever because it slowly got lifted up by what you said, repetition, building a brand, standing for what he stands for, and, not changing his name or anything like that. It's consistent branding over time will get that lift. But you also, he's the first mover too. That speaks to a lot.
Yeah, sustained momentum is what you're really looking for, because in the charts, you might be able to skyrocket to number one for one day and then drop off the chart the next day. But if you can stay in the chart or stay in a particular position, that is a whole lot better, especially if you're hoping to get a new audience from there looking at the charts. You want to stay in that chart. Everything then that we do with these charts, so you can see your historical view, you can see where you rank and such at a quick overview across all of the charts, or across all of the countries too. So you might discover you're number one in Uzbekistan or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And
India.
then maybe,
Always India.
yeah. And you can maybe even point that out to your audience to say, hey, everyone who's listening in Uzbekistan, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Hey, send us a message. Tell us what you like about the podcast. And then those people in that other country suddenly feel seen. Because especially like here in America, I think the rest of the world tends to think Americans think only about themselves. And I'm not necessarily going to disagree with that, because after all, we have the World Series in baseball.
Yeah, of course.
And it is
we're exceptional. We built on exceptionalism, for sure.
So when we can acknowledge someone that is outside of our own area, that helps that other person feel so seen and heard and special. And for everyone else listening, they also realize, oh, so you're not just a stuck-up American or whatever.
Right.
You listen to your audience. You have an audience in other countries. That is really cool. So it boosts your reputation among the rest of your audience. Some of the other cool things that Podgagement does then is everything that we do with a chart, and you're ranking inside that chart. We are also going to, and John, you'll love this, we're going to apply that to search as well. So that unfortunately we can't get the terms from Apple and Spotify that people are using like you can from Google, because Google is a search engine. And so of course they provide that information. But people do search podcast apps for new podcasts to listen to. And some podcasters really want to be found for particular things. Maybe you have a tennis podcast, and so you want to be found for simply the word tennis inside of a podcast app. So what you will soon be able to do inside Podgagement, or maybe it's even available by the time you're listening to this, is you can enter a certain number of terms that you want to be found for, and it will create a new chart and start tracking it from that day forward, so you can see where do you rank within that chart for that search term. So then you can start experimenting with things. You can start making more episodes about those things you want to be found for, and see how is that affecting your chart ranking. Because the way that the chart ranks work when it comes to search is very different from how it works with the normal charts. In search results, so much is based first on keyword relevance. So if your podcast is about tennis, but you don't use the word tennis anywhere in the title of your podcast or title of your episodes.
Yeah, too cool to use the word tennis, huh?
Right. You're not going to show up for a search result for tennis.
Sure.
So use the text that you want to be found for, and try and use it in episode titles as well. So keyword relevance first, and then it seems to be sorted by total lifetime subscriptions based on that keyword as well. So
okay.
There are, like, back when I was doing a podcast about the TV show Once Upon a Time, for I believe only 2 seasons, or maybe it was only 1 season, ABC, the channel that had Once Upon a Time, did an official podcast for the TV show.
Wow.
And they promoted that podcast during the TV show. So of course, that podcast is going to rank number 1 in the search results for that TV show, even though they didn't publish as many episodes as we did. They didn't last as long as we did. And in the search results, then they always dominated number 1. I knew there was nothing we could do to ever overtake them in the search results, because they had a higher number of total lifetime subscriptions. But when it came to the normal charts, if you looked under like the TV and film category back then, we would always be in the chart above them, because we were getting more regular subscriptions and more engagement from our audience through the podcast app than they were. And so we always outranked them in that chart. So the search is completely different, but you want to be able to track that so you can know this is what you want to be found for. Then you can start trying to do things to be found for that, especially when it comes to things that you want to make sure that you're the most relevant result in that. So if you're a tennis podcast, make sure tennis is in the title of your podcast and have episodes that frequently use the name or the word tennis in that too, or some of the other keywords that you might want to be found for. Maybe it's cryptocurrency investing, or maybe it's real estate market, or marriage tips, or whatever it is that you want your podcast found for. You'll be able to add those and track that on a chart made just for you.
I think what you're starting to tap into here kind of alludes to some of one of the questions I was going to ask about. How do people who are not in the charts get in the charts? And you're kind of reverse engineering some of the tools that you have here to help people get in there. I want to approach this topic lightly because it kind of approaches conformity. Like I feel like we might be telling people, yeah, you have to conform to get in the charts because the algorithms, and there is a little bit of that. But what I hear, like things like look at, say you want a wedding show, for example. You mentioned earlier a tool where you could go look at which categories have the least amount of uploads this week or the least amount of shows in general. This is something I've experimented with quite a bit over the past few years, honestly, is just because I have an experimental podcast. So I'll just literally change the category. And within a week, you could find yourself on charts at the top of charts you never even would have guessed. It's inappropriate. It's maybe not even ethical, but because the rules are so opaque and not transparent, it's just kind of fun. But yeah, you definitely make a lot of difference in a beginning podcast and maybe climb up in the charts if you simply do a little research and find out, well, my wedding kind of is society and culture, but it's also self-help or whatever it happens to be that has far fewer competition, then I don't think that that's necessarily a bad idea. What's your thought on that? Like choosing your category before you actually nail down your show?
I always tell people, pick the category that fits the best. Yes, you can change it later on if you realize that something fits better, but I don't recommend trying to pick a category simply because of what else is in that category or how you might be able to potentially rank in that category. Like, yeah, if I put my podcast in the tennis category, I might jump to the top, but does that really matter? Because someone looking for a tennis podcast is not going to be interested in the Audacity to Podcast. That has nothing to do with tennis. So it shouldn't really be in that chart. Pick what fits the best.
Yeah. I think of the same thing. When the last time I changed my categories were based on AI from one of the platforms. I can't remember what it was. It was a major platform. It's like, hey, you should use this category. I'm like, yeah, I guess that's pretty close. I used it and went up to the top. But I'm like, well, it still doesn't feel right, because then I saw the other shows that were in those categories and I'm like, oh, those are actually like serious shows about this topic, whereas mine is not a serious show about this topic, but there's no category for unserious shows that are not comedy. It's not a comedy show, just we don't give a care about that topic. So we're more flippant about it. And I'm like, this is just weird. The chart, like picking your category became a weird thing once I learned that people could use it to bounce around the charts at different levels. But that's only on good pods. Now, that doesn't work on Apple so far as I can tell, because it takes a lot more work to get into the charts. So we could use that one tool to look at categories. And then also, would you recommend somebody starting a show looking and seeing, okay, like again, back to the music reference, we got influence from the guys that were in the clubs when we went out to clubs, 14, 15-year-olds sneaking into clubs, 18-year-olds going to clubs, watching bands. And we're like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. Or no, that guy's goofy looking. And then we'd emulate that. Do you think people should use the charts that are available through Podgagement to maybe emulate what fits them, but use it kind of as a guiding light towards how to make a good show?
I love the way that you worded that, because you did say what fits them and as a guiding light. When I first started podcasting, part of the reason why it took me 2 years from when I wanted to start one to actually starting one was because I was a perfectionist. The other thing was I just wasn't sure my idea would work until I heard a podcast. Now, this podcast is gone now.
Right.
I don't think you can find it anywhere online, but I'm going to mention it just in case someone remembers it from way back then.
Cool.
It was called You Suck at Web Design. And in that podcast, the guy had a fantastic voice, by the way, but in that podcast, he presented his stories, fictionalized stories, in a way that was very similar to what I wanted to do. So I didn't copy him, but what I did get to see is here's someone else doing something similar, and I'm enjoying it. So yes, it does seem that this approach could work. So it's validating the idea. So
right.
you could look at other podcasts out there and use what else is ranking well or doing well as some kind of validation to the idea, but never look at it as a formula that you can simply copy and replace and put yourself in there instead of them. That's
Right.
I don't mean to throw this gentleman under the bus, but I think everyone has probably seen by now Entrepreneurs on Fire from John Lee Dumas.
I have not.
A lot of people,
I love it already.
a lot of people were so inspired by, they thought, oh, it's easy what he's doing. And no, it is not easy. But what he does, and he's done this for years, is he has a daily show where he interviews entrepreneurs. And for years, he asked the same questions of each entrepreneur. So many other people thought, oh, this is a formula. I can just copy and paste this formula and put myself in it and have his same success. So this spawned a whole bunch of podcasts that were something on fire podcasts.
I don't even know anything about this, and I've been podcasting for years.
Oh, bless your virgin ears.
Jesus Louises, I got to find out this after we finish up. Okay, no, keep going. That's wild.
But so many people were just thinking, oh, all I have to do is just interview other people in this field and ask every person the same question and do that episode after episode. And then I'll have the same success as John Lee Dumas and be able to move overseas and do all of these cool things like he does. And I'll have the big success that he does. No, it's not that. You cannot just copy and paste a formula, but you can be inspired by it. You can see it validating some ideas, and you can start to deconstruct some of the things that they're doing to realize, like, for example, with John Lee Dumas, the way it works for him is he made a particular set of questions that he wanted to be able to ask every entrepreneur. It's like, I want to know what every entrepreneur thinks about this. And that's why he built that list of questions. And it's very similar questions that other people have as well. He put himself in his audience's chair and really thought, what would my audience want to hear as well? What would inspire them? And some of the stuff too that they might not know that they want, what can I bring to them to help them better whatever their pursuits are? So that's what made him successful. And some of that is the stuff that other people who are trying to copy that formula aren't realizing. They're just thinking, oh, all I have to do is the same list of questions. Or like the Joe Rogan thing is, all I have to do is sit down with someone and talk about whatever we want to for 3 hours and we'll get rich.
That's so crazy, dude. It's like, because my son and I got into baking since COVID, right? Or I should say cooking, because baking, it turns out, is much more difficult. It's so scientific that you can't just swap out one thing that looks the same for the next at all. You can't. I mean, everything has to be so specific. And I think of people like that a lot is like when a group comes together, we're all different elements of the chemistry, and even one person makes the biggest difference. So when you consider a podcast, there's at least one person involved, might be 2, 3, 5 or whatever. Yeah, copying everybody specifically. I think of it a lot like, again, the music industry, where you're just looking at other bands like, yeah, okay, people tend to like that. Let's jam on that kind of music. But then every once in a while, disco will come around and everyone will make a disco album. So then you got Kiss playing disco. It's sometimes like, nope, not everybody should do every type of show. So just because you heard a great show that you loved doesn't mean you're the right element to recreate that show.
They might be completely different, might not have any crossover audience whatsoever. But speaking of crossover audience, that leads into talking about one of the other features that I really enjoy that Podgagement does. I call it networking. Where if you look at a podcast inside, let's take Apple Podcasts, for example. You look at a podcast in Apple Podcasts, scroll down to the bottom of the listing, and you'll see a section that says, you might also like.
Yeah, my favorite.
Or it's very similar to Amazon, where it's people who bought this also bought that.
Mm-hmm.
It is that kind of thing, that the people who listen to this podcast also listen to these other podcasts. The podcasts that are listed on yours, I call that outgoing networking, because they're outgoing from yours to those other podcasts. And it's populated based on an algorithm that is essentially what percentage of your audience is listening to these other podcasts. Not what percentage of them, but what percentage of your audience. That's the outgoing.
That's cool.
That is limited to 15 podcasts at most inside Apple Podcasts. And we do track that. And we'll track if something new shows up or something else pops out. So that from that, I call it networking because that's what I want this to do, is enable you to network with these other podcasters. Like you could do cross-guesting with them, cross-promotion with them. You could collaborate on something. Or you could even look at it as maybe a little bit of competitive analysis, see what other people are listening to, that maybe you can learn from what seems to be working, or just learn what you can do better. So that's all the outgoing. What I think is even more impressive is the incoming networking. And this is where our system looks at the nearly 3 million other podcasts out there in Apple Podcasts and looks to see which of them are linking back to your podcast. So this is information that you would have to view all 3 million other podcasts in order to find which of them were doing this. We do it automatically for you. And this is a much bigger list. Like I'm looking inside Podgagement right now, just at a sample podcast, No Such Thing as a Fish. It's a podcast from the United Kingdom, great comedy podcast, especially if you like interesting facts presented in a funny way. So their outgoing list has only 15 podcasts in it. And no coincidence, they're mostly BBC hosted podcasts there. Their incoming section has 614 podcasts in it.
Wow, great.
So they've got crossover audience with these 614 other podcasts, enough crossover audience to be statistically relevant. So this is a much bigger list that some of these you might never have known that you had crossover audience with some of them. So this can tell you, especially if you're an interview show, this can tell you here are other podcasters that maybe I should have on my podcast, or maybe I should approach them to see if I could be a guest on their podcast or do that cross-guesting or anything like that. And you can track this huge number. There are some podcasters I've seen who have more than 1,000 other podcasts linking back to theirs.
Is this all the data you're getting from Apple, but they just don't show it in their interface?
Well, that's the thing. They do show it in their interface, but you have to view every one of those 3 million podcasts in order to see that list.
They don't care that much to show it. It's available, but they're like, good luck.
Right. They're not connecting it out. And yes, there are even tools out there that allow you to start from your podcast and then kind of view the branch out. But as far as I know, no one is showing who links back to your podcast. And so that's what we're doing. And I love calling it networking because it really changes your focus on thinking about the relationship aspect of this.
That's so important. I think that's one of the most important things of these apps. In the podcasting realm, my concept of what a podcast technically is has kind of remained the same forever, like we discussed earlier. But my concept of a podcast as a business has been evolving lately. Yes. And I'm just starting to think that podcast will always be the punk rock garage band. You know, like when people say, how do we make more money out of podcasting? I'm like, what do you mean? How do you make more money out of garage band? You turn it into a major band. Like you make a podcast into money by turning it into a broadcast television show. You know what I mean? Or a movie. Yep. And they're like, I think this is just the lowest rung. And people might be expecting too much in the craftsman stage or the practice stage or the apprentice stage down here at the bottom where everyone's just learning how to use a mic and what a show really is. Do you ever feel a lot of pressure into making money from the quote unquote podcast industry?
For sure. And it's strange that people tend to think of that for podcasting, but they don't think of that for many other hobbies like baseball card collecting. People don't think, how am I going to make money collecting baseball cards? But they do frequently think about how do they make money making a podcast. And I think the reason for that is because they recognize they are creating value. Whereas with baseball card collecting, you're just collecting things. So you're receiving value. You are collecting value.
You're holding it, yeah.
Yeah, you're not making anything else that you're sharing with other people. So if you have a podcast, you are creating at least some kind of value. I hope so. And you're engaging with people in at least some way. And so I think that's why we tend to think, how can I get some value back from my audience? And so many podcasters just first think of sponsorships because of course they hear the ads in all of these other podcasts.
Yeah.
But sponsorships really aren't worth it unless you have a massive audience or an audience that is so engaged, they will buy whatever you talk about regardless of the price. Like if you've got a podcast that's listened to by the top 10 billionaires, then you're going to make a lot of money. We talk about CPMs in podcasting, which is the amount you get paid per 1,000 downloads.
Yep.
To get a sponsor to be in front of the top 10 billionaires, that is worth so much more than any other podcast is making with a sponsorship. So don't think about like $25 CPM or anything like that. Think about what is the best value I can deliver to my audience. And really, the best approach, I think, that can scale infinitely with a podcast, regardless of the size of the audience, the best way to monetize is to build a business. The podcast could be one part of that business.
Straight up. Mm-hmm.
Like for my own podcast, the Audacity to Podcast, in the very early days, I had some sponsors. And now I actually regret ever having sponsors. I don't have sponsors anymore.
Interesting.
I even joke that I can't afford sponsors because the podcast builds my business. My whole business exists because of the podcast.
Yep.
But when the podcast has been on a hiatus, I have seen my business income significantly drop. So that tells me the podcast is worth a whole lot, even though I'm not selling any sponsorships in the podcast. It is the affiliates that I mentioned here and there in the episodes. I only mention things I believe in and that are contextually relevant, but especially just the reputation, the brand building, the business building that the podcast does for me is worth so much more than a sponsor would be.
Yeah, that's a really valid point. I've thought that a long time because, well, frankly, I came from the music industry and I kind of sucked it up when I was about 16 that was never going to pay unless you just literally make it. And what does that mean? You get signed? Is there a version of getting signed in the podcast world? Probably. It's probably getting signed by a Netflix or ABC News or something. That is a pipe dream. So to me, you're right. Podcasting could be like a fun hobby, practice, go to the gym, keep using the mic, keep talking, do all the things that podcasters do. But if you want to make money, it's have a business, attach it to a business, either your own. And there's been a couple of instances where I've been employed at a regular job and I convinced them that, hey, part of my job duties should be creating a podcast for this business. So therefore, I got moved out of stupid, boring work into podcasting for a great sponsor, my employer.
Nice.
And that's a great way too. Not everybody's inclined to invent a thing, a whole business just to have a podcast. But man, if you are thinking of, not you, Daniel, but if you, the listener, are thinking of trying to make money with the podcast, I highly suggest just going to your boss and saying, hey, can I do a podcast? Can this be part of my job? Or, have a thing to sell already in mind, whether it's a brand of t-shirts like the Hundreds kid, Bobby Hundreds, or whether it's anything, a thing to sell, because you'll find that a lot of times people get so click happy, a Mr. Beast or a Logan Paul, those kind of guys, they got so popular, they had nothing to sell. Now they ended up shipping literally like sugar water around the world. Like because they can't, nobody can afford to sponsor those guys, so they have to sell their own stuff. And they finally came around to that. So yeah, definitely find a thing to sell first if you want to make money podcasting, because podcasting is one of the ultimate tools for selling anything. It's amazing how many companies still don't podcast.
And I love it so much because, especially in audio is so much more portable. It's easier to edit. It's cheaper to produce and everything. But in audio versus writing, in writing, you can edit a sentence to perfection, sure. But in audio, people get to hear how you communicate, how your enthusiasm is behind it, how confident you are in discussing these things. And yes, you can cover up some stuff here and there with edits, sure, but you really cannot edit in authenticity. And you can't edit it out either. Yes, you could be robotic in the podcast and how you present the information, and people will hear that and they'll turn off from that.
They will.
But
I think so. I hope so.
People will hear your heart. They'll hear your smile. They'll hear your anger when you're really upset at something.
Yeah.
They'll hear your passion for the subject. And that kind of emotional energy is contagious. And it also helps build your reputation because people can see how good are you at communicating, especially if you record your episodes on the fly or you're a guest on an episode or something like that. People can hear how confidently do you answer? How prepared are you? How good can you speak off the cuff? How relevant are your illustrations? All of these things that are ways that you can communicate better, and your audience can hear that. And then they realize, boy, this person, she really knows her stuff. So whatever kind of product she's selling, it must be a really good product if she's this good on the podcast.
Very authoritative. I love that. That gets back to the jam session kind of mentality, or maybe the improv folks might relate is I think a good podcaster can just jam well with other podcasters that are good. You get a couple musicians in a room and someone says, "Hey, what do you guys want to jam?" And drummer starts a beat, bass player throws in a line, and now you're off and running. Now instantly, everyone in the room respects each other because hey, we can all jam together. So it's always nice getting fellow podcasters like yourself on the show because it makes editing so much easier. I think I counted maybe 8 times you or I just messed up a word, and I'm like, cool, the rest is flowing really nicely here.
Right.
So Podgagement is the app. I just encourage people to go look at it. Like, let's give them a heads up, though, on pricing. Can we talk about that? Do you mind? Because sometimes the people think, people assume everything is free these days. I'm like, no, good stuff costs money. And your interface and your design, everything's very elegant and intuitive. And what are the costs currently or maybe going forward if you're expecting to up the costs?
Yeah, we charge based on how many podcasts that you want to track. And just in case no one is clear on this yet, by podcast, I mean your overall show, not your individual episodes. I remember someone was signing up and they were saying, I've got 100 episodes. So does that mean I need the 100 podcast plan? I told them, no, you need just the one podcast plan.
For that
you've got one podcast,
feed, the RSS
unlimited
feed.
episodes. Yeah. So it is based on how many shows that you want to track in your account. And for the full feature suite, it's only $19 a month, and that includes everything that we offer right now, and that's per podcast. Or if you want to pay on a yearly basis, then you get basically 2 months free from that.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good deal. I think that's fair too, because a lot of us have found free ways to record anyway, so we're not paying for hosting. I mean, like I didn't hit the record button here on Riverside because I paid for Hindenburg many years ago. What else are we not paying for? Spreaker, because I'm on the free plan. So those kind of things, I think a lot of podcasters I talk to on this level are like, oh, it costs more money. Yeah, but look, you cheapskate, you're not paying for money anywhere else. And if you want to really kind of bolster that comparison thing, and people say, oh, you shouldn't compare yourself to others. Well, then what are you doing? You're flying in the dark. If you were in a plane, you'd want to compare yourself to the ground. So the idea that you just fly around in the fog without insight into anything seems slightly foolish. And I think $20 a month seems fair to me.
Well, thank you. And everything costs. So even if you're using something for free, someone is paying what it costs. And that could even be that you're selling your audience or maybe even selling your soul.
Usually
to someone.
The latter, right. Yeah.
But we do offer a free trial. So even if you just want to sign up, see what it can do for your podcast, go over to podgagement.com, click the Get Started button. You can sign up for the free trial and just try it free for 2 weeks over there.
Totally. Well, and of course, I'll put all these links below, so don't crash a car trying to write any of this down. I really appreciate your tone, your style, and your stick with it, because you've been working on the app now for years. Yeah. And we finally turned the page to where it's now called Podgagement, and it looks fantastic. So hopefully you, the listener, will go check it out. And that's about 10 people, basically. I've got about 10 listeners, but they're all well-placed podcasters who might also...
Imagine those 10 people in a room listening to you episode after episode.
Well, and I'm imagining them telling their 10 friends and so on and so forth. So, yeah, everything does trickle out, and I always try to keep it realistic. Yeah, because the 10 people that keep coming back, yeah, I appreciate that. I have enough fans or listeners that we could all fit in a van and cross-country tour like an old band.
Maybe you'll do that someday.
Well, here, we'll close on this, but we have to think of ways to spread our podcast after the grid collapses.
Ain't nobody got time for that.